Middlesex.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I'd like to thank my colleague from York-Simcoe for putting Bill C-280, the Financial Protection for Fresh Fruit and Vegetables Act, forward. It's a very important bill, and it's been a long time coming. I know I've been elected for almost 4 years, and we've been talking about this through the last 2 parliaments, and I know it's been talked about long before then. And it's great to see all parties come together to support something that will help our Canadian produce growers, packers, and shippers immensely. Speaker, during a Zoom call with the Canadian fruit and vegetable growers, I heard that 52% of perishable product sales to the U.S. customers from Canadian suppliers await payment from the United States. California producers and suppliers have a similar problem with their Canadian customers. On October 1st, 2014, the United States Department of Agriculture revoked preferred treatment for Canadian shippers under the Perishable Agricultural Commodities Act. This was taken in retaliation for an action on the part of Canada with regard to establishing some type of trust protection from bankruptcy for all fresh produce shipped into the U.S. Under that status, Canadian companies did not have to post surety bonds when trying to collect payments from delinquent buyers, and no other nation had such status. Without that special status, a Canadian shipper must now post a bond for twice the amount that they are seeking to collect. Taking action to recover $100,000 would require the purchase of a $200,000 bond. Current rules severely limit the ability of produce growers and sellers to collect payment in the event that their buyer declares bankruptcy. While products like electronics can be reclaimed by the seller, highly perishable produce is lost because of, well, the obvious. It spoils and it rots very quickly, costing Canadian and U.S. firms which operate in Canada an average of $19 million per year. But Speaker, there's a policy solution to this. In 1984, the United States Congress established deemed trust provisions through the Perishable Agricultural Commodities Act, also known as PACA, and that protected shippers in the event that their buyer became insolvent. The PACA trust helps suppliers of perishable products ensure prompt payment by buyers. The trust gives suppliers interest in a debtor's assets. Creating a reciprocal legal framework in Canada by federal statute for a PACA-like deemed trust would not draw on federal or provincial public treasuries, but it would offer Canadian producers and suppliers the means to collect on accounts payable from U.S. customers and give U.S. producers and suppliers the means to collect on accounts payable from Canadian customers. Madam Speaker, my colleagues have gone into a lot of the details of this bill, and I'd like to take a little bit of a different approach. I'd like to give some personal perspective on a little history of my experience in the fresh produce sector to provide some personal context on how this legislation will benefit growers and shippers. I grew up on a produce farm. I'm a third-generation farmer, and my grandparents on both sides of my family were essentially pioneers in the produce industry in the area that I grew up in, which is my hometown of Grand Bend, Ontario. Now, my dad's parents, my Oma and Opa, they immigrated from Holland and were one of the first 5 families to start farming on what's called the Klondike Marsh. My mom's parents immigrated to Canada from Poland via Germany, and then they moved to Grand Bend after living in the Chatham area, where they first started growing vegetables. They cleared their land, they began farming in the Grand Bend Bog, which used to be a shallow lake that was drained to become rich farmland. They grew potatoes, onions, carrots, lettuce, and onion sets over the years, and eventually my dad's parents retired, and the family farm that my grandparents started, which involved 2 families now, we took over growing some of the vegetables that my Oma and Opa used to grow. And Speaker, farmers are innovators, and I'd like to give you one example from personal experience. When I was growing up, it'd be time to harvest our potatoes, and my dad would go out to the field and hand dig potatoes to see what stage of growth they were at. And there were many things that farmers can automate, but this is not one that can be automated. This is still done by putting your hands in the dirt and digging those little nuggets out of the ground by hand. So when my dad would do these test digs, he would bring these little nuggets, potato nuggets, home. And we'd never waste them. We would cook them up and eat them for supper. And let me tell you, those were the most absolutely delicious potatoes. And to provide context, back in the 80s when I grew up, the CFIA regulations stipulated that undersized potatoes could not be packaged. So all those small, undersized potatoes that we harvested would either be discarded for cattle feed or put in a compost pile. And there was an enormous amount of perfectly good for eating potatoes that became food waste because of packaging regulations. So there came a point where my mom thought, well, geez, these potatoes, we're always throwing these out, and these are these undersized potatoes, and they're the most delicious thing ever. So why are we doing this when they taste so good? These little mini nuggets were so delicious, we wanted to be able to share them with everybody else. So our farm made an application to the CFIA asking that we be able to bag these little mini potatoes and sell them. And so the gourmet mini potato bag was born, and our family farm became the first farm in Canada to bring mini potatoes to market. Now you're probably wondering, okay, why the short history lesson on your family farm? Well, I wanted to provide context from the unique perspective that I hold as the only current parliamentarian who's still involved in the fresh produce industry and produce farming. Now, before my parents retired from farming, their farm was growing over 1,000 acres of potatoes in southwestern Ontario for grocery retailers. And to meet grocery stores' expectations, we also relied on local smaller farms, as well as smaller farms from across Canada in different provinces to supply us with Canadian product in our season. And if we couldn't supply the grocery stores with the product that they wanted when they wanted it, then they wouldn't even consider you as a farm to be a supplier. But the grocery stores had to supply year-round. So we had to grow potatoes around North America in order to keep the supply going to supply grocery stores. So we had farms contracted to custom grow for us in California, Florida, Idaho, North Carolina, and Michigan. And our packing facility in Grand Bend used to process anywhere from 5,000 to 6,000 acres through it per year. Now you can imagine the coordination that it would take to keep everything going when you have farms across North America supplying you. There would be a constant flow of trucks coming back and forth from all over the United States into Canada, and from Canada into the States. And the potatoes would be coming for us to process and package in our plant so that we could then give Canadians fresh potatoes for their grocery store shelves. And we had to do this year-round, so bringing upwards of 4,000 acres of fresh potatoes across the border from Canada, from the United States every year. You can imagine the dollar value that would be for that product. But not only did we pack potatoes from the US, we also exported our excess crop during harvest season to the United States. Because you see, the growing season in the United States is different from Canada's growing season in many parts. And being neighbors, we rely on each other to ensure a fresh food supply year-round. Canadians grow an abundance of fresh, perishable food, far greater than what we consume. And we're blessed to live in a country to be able to do so. But with that comes a huge amount of risk. In this industry, it's standard practice to be paid 30 to 45 days from the time a product is received. So as you can imagine, the shelf life of fresh produce is far less than the payment terms that sellers are working with. The intricacies of our supply chain for fresh food are far greater than anyone could ever imagine. When farmers are exporting millions of dollars in perishable food from the United States without a reciprocal agreement to ensure that they have a mechanism to be paid in the event of a dispute or a bankruptcy, it becomes a risky business that with one bad deal or one dispute, it could literally bankrupt a family farm. Especially since most companies cannot afford to put up a bond worth double what they are disputing. Produce farmers work on such tight margins that one sale of $250,000 or $500,000, which could be 3 to 5 tractor trailer loads of goods to one customer in the States, which they might not get paid for, could bankrupt a smaller farmer. And while this might sound extreme, I've seen this happen to a young farmer, and it firsthand. In Canada, when there is a dispute between growers and sellers in this country, we have a mechanism to resolve those disputes. But without the deemed trust, we have no mechanism to resolve disputes between growers and sellers in the United States and Canada that is affordable for growers to access. Speaker, I'm very passionate about this industry because it's literally been my family's bread and butter my entire life. And I have friends across the industry who would welcome this important change because it will help protect the livelihoods of families and farms and their businesses. So creating this deemed trust and having that reciprocal agreement with the U.S. would protect farms from having to bear those losses in the event of a dispute. This will save family farms. I will always fight for Canadian farmers and their livelihoods and their legacies. At a time when food security and food sovereignty are top of mind, this is needed to protect this industry in Canada, and that's why I support this bill on behalf of my constituents and consumers. Thank you, Madam Speaker.